Today, we are going to talk about the trending reasons why workers are quitting and what HR can do about it. Startling research has found that Gen Z workers in their mid-20s and younger are not afraid to leave a job within 6 months if they feel the role isn't a good fit for them. And the number one reason they are leaving? To break down what is happening, what it means for you, we reached out to Kathryn Minshew, CEO and founder of the Muse. Kathryn Minshew is CEO and founder of the Muse, a career platform used by over 70 million people to find jobs at companies whose people, benefits, and values align with their unique professional needs. Under her leadership, the Muse has pioneered the concept of values-based job search and was recently named one of Fast Company's 50 most innovative companies in the world. In 2022, Kathryn led the Muse's acquisition of fairygodboss.com, the largest online career community for women. Kathryn is the host of the Muse's podcast, The New Rules of Work, and her first book, The New Rules of Work, The Muse Playbook for Navigating Your Career, was a Wall Street Journal national bestseller. She has spoken at MIT and Harvard, contributed to the Wall Street Journal and Harvard Business Review, and appeared on Today and CNN. Kathryn, we are so excited to have you join us today. Welcome to Voices of HR.
Thank you so much. I am really excited to be here.
Well, we are so excited to have you because your new research is shedding light, I think, on a problem that we all know exists. But until I read your research and I spoke to you, I didn't know how pervasive the issue was. So let's start here. Your research indicated that 75%, huge portion of Gen Z and younger who are currently in the workforce will quit their job within the first 6 months for this number one reason. What is it, and what should HR do about it?
Absolutely. So the number one reason, the challenge that we hear again and again from Gen Z and millennial talent is a mismatch between their expectations before starting a job and the reality when they get in that role. We called it shift shock because we wanted to put a name to a term that millions of people experience, but that I think hasn't gotten its due. This idea of shift shock, of the disconnect or the surprise or regret in some cases that occurs when a job that you start is nothing like what you expected. It's creating a massive amount of disappointment, of frustration. And as you highlighted in your intro, it's leading a lot of candidates to quit or to consider quitting. And that has huge challenges for HR.
It absolutely does, because as we all know, turnover is an incredible expense for most organizations. So take us back to when it comes to the disconnect between what they expected and what they're actually experiencing. Is there a reason for that? Did you find it was the job description? Did you find that maybe they weren't asking the right questions? What was there a main reason why there was a disconnect?
So there are a couple of things going on here. One of them is a gap in the questions that many candidates have about a workplace environment, the communication style, the expectations, and the reality of what a company is like. Sometimes this gap occurs because the recruiters don't have the information to accurately communicate company culture and work experience. Sometimes recruiters are intentionally giving candidates an optimistic view. Sometimes that order comes directly from management. We've also seen that a lot of people within, particularly the Gen Z and millennial demographic, are talking about this idea of toxic workplaces and of feeling like there are companies out there, again, not all companies, thank goodness, but some companies out there that are disrespectful, that are abusive. I can get in a little bit more what they mean by toxic. But it's been really interesting for us to see, firstly, that just under 80% of Gen Z and millennial employees say that they have experienced a toxic workplace at some point in their career. Female respondents were more likely to report toxic experiences versus respondents that identify as male or non-binary. And what do they do when they encounter a workplace that they feel is toxic? In most cases, they leave, or in some cases, they are actively trying to leave but haven't done so yet. This also ties in with concepts that I'm sure all of your listeners have been reading about in the news, like quiet quitting, where people may still stay in a job but give the bare minimum. So I think understanding this issue was really important for us at the Muse, and it's partially why we've continued to do research into how do Gen Z and millennial candidates characterize their workplaces, what causes them to leave, and when they say toxic, what exactly do they mean by it?
Yeah, so help us. So this is unfortunately music to my ears, and I only say that because again, I'm so glad that you're shedding light on toxicity in the workplace, because what I found when I wrote my book and the research that I conducted, and we're aligned on this, is that Gen Z won't tolerate it. Whereas my generation, maybe even a little bit of your generation, felt stuck. And they had to. They had to tolerate those 80% of bosses that are good to poor, or stay in situations that actually was detrimental to their personal health or mental health, their physical health. So, can you give us a little bit more information on how your respondents define toxicity?
Absolutely. So, in the most recent survey we did on toxicity, the number one way that respondents defined a toxic workplace was disrespectful. This was chosen by over half of respondents. We did let them choose more than one, but disrespectful was far and away the most common response. And that was followed by abusive, non inclusive, unethical, and then cutthroat at last. And it was very interesting because you can see in these adjectives that were chosen by, again, a survey of thousands of Gen Z and millennial employees, that they range from, again, abusive is a fairly clear cut word that I would say is probably at the most people generally understand abusive situations to be problematic, but disrespectful and uninclusive also came up with pretty substantial numbers of respondents. And I think that you make a well, you made a number of great points. I think we're very, very aligned here, that what people expect from work and how they expect to be treated and how they will tolerate being treated, it's changed dramatically in the last 2 years, the last 10 years. I think we're seeing this really interesting arc. And when I first started working, I remember one of my first jobs. They sat us down and they very, very clearly communicated explicitly, the expectation is that you will stay here for a minimum of 2 years. And if you leave before then, it will be a black mark on your resume that you may never recover from. And when you lock people into that sort of mentality, that if you start a new job, you have to tough it out, that I think creates an environment where people are forced to put up with a lot more, and where sometimes businesses can treat people less well because they feel like they've got them locked in. What we're seeing very, very clearly in the data is that that is changing. And in fact, as you said earlier, 80% of Gen Z and millennial candidates told us that they would quit a new job in under 6 months if it wasn't as advertised, if they weren't treated well. And so I think we're seeing this fluidity in the labor market. We absolutely saw it in the Great Resignation with higher numbers of people leaving roles than we've ever seen before. But one of the consequences or the repercussions is it is causing businesses, I think, to ask the question, how do we proactively keep our people as opposed to just assuming that they'll stay? And it's shining a light on some of the behaviors like a toxic manager or a disrespectful workplace that are most likely to drive people away.
Mhm. It is, and I always put the onus back on both the C-suite and HR to create these environments that are healthy for everyone. right? Everybody
Yes.
wants healthy workplaces. And, this really sheds a light on where we could make the substantive changes needed in order to create something, to create a workplace where everyone can shine.
Yeah, and that's actually that's an important point too, because we asked respondents in our survey who they held most responsible for a toxic workplace, and far and away the answer was senior leadership. That was over their direct manager, over their coworkers, over their immediate team, and I think it shows that the the permissiveness of toxic, disrespectful, abusive, unethical, cutthroat behavior that comes from the top, or it doesn't come from the top, or there's a clear message communicated that that isn't tolerated. And as I've built the Muse over the last 12 years, I've had to make a lot of really, really hard decisions as a CEO, as a leader, but I've tried to be very clear with my team and externally that culture is made in the hard decisions. It's easy if somebody is a terrible human and a low performer to exit them from a business. It's much more complicated if they are terrible to their colleagues or their directs, and they hit their numbers. That's where I think employees are looking around and saying, do we really value certain things as a business? Do we really have standards about how we treat each other? Or do those standards only apply when it's convenient? And I think that, it's easy as a leader, I think, especially with the mentality that we all had of work, perhaps a decade ago. I've talked to a lot of leaders who believe that just protecting these like very problematic, again, sometimes abusive leaders is what they have to do as a business. It's just work. But we're now seeing that candidates are not shy about not taking your job or taking your job and leaving, if they are walking into an environment where they're going to be subjected to certain behaviors. And so I remember when I first started the Muse and I was first talking about just principles that are very simple now. Employer branding, the idea that companies need to communicate their offering, their value prop to candidates, just in the same way as candidates have to sell us. And it was a bit controversial at the time in the very early days, but everyone was talking about millennials, and I remember just saying, like, a lot of millennials are just asking for the things that would benefit everybody. Everybody, I think most people want to be treated better. They want to be treated with a baseline level of respect. But each new generation, I think, has an opportunity as they enter the workforce to look at some of the things that are just done as a matter of course and say, no, I don't think so. And as much as, I think we love to complain, or some people love to complain about Gen Z this or millennial that, there's a lot of very positive, changes that I think we're seeing, particularly in terms of um, building more respectful, more kind workplaces. There's also fascinating data that shows that enthusiasm is worth like 15 points of IQ. So if your people simply care, it's like you elevated the IQ of your entire team by 15 points. I think if more leaders really understood the difference between a demotivated, doing it out of fear or doing it out of kind of rote responsibility workforce versus like the right force, the group of people that is aligned with your mission and that feels respected and therefore is giving you their best in return, I think it has the potential to really revolutionize the way we think about employers and the social contract between individuals and the places where they work.
Absolutely agree. And as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about leaders who show up one way to senior leadership and show up a completely different way to their team and instill fear and, bullying tactics in order to get them to the results that they want. And sometimes it is achieved in the short term at a huge expense to the firm and the brand and the culture. And the senior leaders don't see it. So I think for HR, as we kind of wrap up this part on toxicity, it's HR look for the the feet people, Gen Z is going to vote with their feet when it comes to your culture and whether they like the leader. It's no longer going to be just looking at 360 feedback and all of that, because that can always be manipulated, right? Because they could be afraid of their leader. So they're voting with their feet is what it sounds like you're saying.
Yeah. And I think being, putting in place channels and opportunities for people to give you that feedback, whether it's exit interviews, whether it's anonymous or small group feedback, in addition to that retention data, is so powerful because there's that great stat that 80% of Americans consider themselves an above average driver. And I think fewer than 1% consider themselves worse than average. Similarly, most people don't want to think of themselves as being a toxic leader or presiding over an unhealthy workplace. But when you and of course, there's always going to be someone who's unhappy. So I think it can be hard. Any leader or any HR professional can sometimes find it difficult to distinguish between occasional complaints and a more serious problem. But I think we are seeing that the consequences of not being aware of a toxicity problem in your workplace or a retention problem are massive. And I'm glad that there's more light being shown on the issue. I think that we still have a lot to do culturally, and HR is in some cases a very tough position if the leadership doesn't want to take into account or to take responsibility for their role in it. So I've spent a lot of time talking with HR leaders that are doing a phenomenally good job walking a tightrope between the two and helping make the workplace work better for everyone.
Yeah, they are central. They are central and they have an incredibly tough job. So speaking of HR, I believe you had said before that 41%, I think was your number, that Gen Z workers will decide within 2 to 6 months whether to leave their job or whether they want to stay. And that HR pros may be feeling the pressure to really be perfect in the presentation of jobs and their company to candidates in order to hire or retain them. But you have said that may be counterintuitive. Why?
Yes, I think that it is a myth that serves no one that there is such a thing as the perfect job or the perfect company. It's kind of like the perfect girlfriend or the perfect husband. Humans are complicated, deeply flawed and wonderful creatures. And collections of humans, companies, share some of those same traits around, they have personalities, they have beautiful positive attributes, and they have sometimes more messy or complicated attributes. And I think that we've done ourselves a disservice by acting as if there's such thing as a single best place to work, or that what we should tell a candidate is just how incredibly happy and excited they're going to be if they take this job. It's going to solve all their problems and, they'll never have an unhappy day in their life. Like, we're laughing because that's ridiculous. And similarly, when I hear people, a lot of people have asked, why didn't the Muse have, the best places to work list, like a lot of different media sites have had. And, we're more of a job search marketplace than a media site. But the bigger reason is that I think that would be as silly as saying, these are the 50 best people to marry in, Austin, Texas, or New York City. Like, who you should marry is a very personal decision that rests on your values, your personality, your quirks, what sort of life you want to live, what sort of idiosyncrasies and challenges you are willing to put up with for the rest of your life. And luckily, employment is not a lifetime commitment, but it is one that's going to, take up 40, 50, 60 plus hours of brain space every single week. And so I really encourage HR professionals to think about, what is it truly like, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the beauty and the challenge, and how can I give candidates a reasonably accurate understanding of what they would be saying yes to if they say yes to us. And that's terrifying to some people, because I certainly talk to HR professionals who say, well, I have to oversell the job. I have to give people the rosy impression. They'd never come work here otherwise. And look, it's a bit of a balance. I think if you read any dating advice, I'll just keep on this metaphor because I do find it works very well, because most people have some experience. We're not saying that you go to a first date and you bring every piece of dirty laundry from your past.
Right.
You have to show up as yourself, and you're of course putting your best foot forward, but you have to be real, because if you are disingenuous in those early conversations, you might end up with someone who wants to date a totally different person. And that really wastes both of your times. So as similarly for HR leaders, for recruiters, sometimes, by the way, this is a message that hiring managers and functional leaders really need to hear, because they often can get wrapped up in this idea of selling the dream. But what we have seen is that candidates want the reality. They want enough of the details that they can make an informed decision. And again, when those details are aligned closely enough with what they're looking for, what they're willing to accept, you're much more likely to get an enthusiastic yes. You're much more likely to get a retained employee, a productive employee, a successful employee. On the flip side, when people feel that the impression they've been given of a job, of a team, of a company is not the reality that they encounter when they walk in the door, they're much more likely to report disengagement. They are much more likely to report frustration and other kind of negative emotions. And most importantly, they're much more likely to leave. And that's where that statistic that we talked about came from. 41% of candidates in our recent survey would only evaluate a new job for 2 to 6 months before deciding that it wasn't right, if there was that mismatch or that misalignment. And so as hard as it can be to tell people, some of the challenges. And again, there's ways of saying, hey, look, we are really great at XYZ. We also sometimes find that candidates who expect ABC can get frustrated because timelines take longer here, or we require a lot of input to make a decision. It's not that you necessarily need to go, all kind of dark and and vulnerable in an early conversation, but I find that candidates really appreciate that transparency. And frankly, if someone is going to opt out based on something that is true, wouldn't you rather have them opt out now versus going through the time and expense of hiring them, closing down the role in some cases, bringing them on, training them, onboarding them, and then realizing, oh, this person is deeply unhappy in this job. Like that's not, especially in an environment where we have a fairly liquid marketplace for talent, that is not a recipe for success.
That is so true. It's like, it's kind of quality over maybe quantity. I think companies were feeling so much pressure to get employees in the door during the pandemic and after. And it was like, was the quality bar going down a little bit just for the sake of getting people in the door? And as we know, that does just cause churn and burn as an after effect.
It does. And I think that, one of the challenges that I see system-wide across the HR industry is that many recruiters and HR leaders at the most fundamental level are only gold for how quickly or how cheaply they can close a role, not for whether that person stays even for 3 or 6 months, or whether that person is successful. After 90 days or 120 days after hiring, would the hiring manager hire that person again? There's a huge difference between trying to find the right role and trying to find the quickest or the cheapest butt in seat. And, I've had a lot of experience with working on comp plans for sales teams. You get the behavior that you incentivize or that you reward often. And so, I think that for anyone who has decision-making power at a company over the hiring process, I always encourage them to look at, can you reward or incentivize your recruiters who find the best people, the right people, the ones that are truly successful in your organization, because that can take a little longer and cost a little more
Mm-hmm.
than just getting a butt in the seat. But I think most people would agree, that should be the goal that we're aspiring to.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting to see, in my experience, most people agree conceptually and then have a very, very hard time putting it into practice.
And I can imagine that this also happens in the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because another component of your report along the lines of toxicity showed that I think it was 74% of workers between the ages of 25 and 40, and maybe 79% between the age of 41 and 56 were experiencing toxicity in the workplace. Those are both incredibly high percentages. So it's not just happening to Gen Z, it's actually happening to women, people of color, those who are maybe on your more mature side in the workplace. So, what can HR pros do and prioritize to keep this from becoming the number one reason for turnover?
Mm-hmm. So there's a few things that we've seen be fairly effective. One is listening to your current people in a variety of forms. Now, how you listen in a 15 or 20 person company is going to be very, very different than in a 35,000 person organization. Some organizations use anonymous or named surveys, small focus groups, exit interviews. There's a many variety of tools. But what I think is really important is that if you are truly committed to hearing the answer and to taking some action, your employees will often tell you where the problems are. And again, some of that is in the raw data around who's leaving and who's not. But particularly if your organization hasn't burned prior goodwill by punishing people who share negative news, which is that's a whole separate problem. I have found that when the HR team or another leader or authority figure goes to the team and says, we want to make sure that working here is a positive force in your life.
Mm-hmm.
We want you to be engaged. We want you to be more productive. We want you to stay. Help us understand what matters the most. And I find expectation setting is very helpful. Sometimes leaders think, if I ask for feedback, people are going to tell me 100 things and then they'll be angry if I don't do all of them. That's actually not how most people work, especially if you set expectations up front. So I've seen leaders do this effectively by saying, we want to hear everything that matters to you, and we want to understand how much it matters. Now, we are not going to be able to fix everything, but we are going to look at this data and commit to tackling 3 of the things that come up most frequently and that we believe we can really affect. And once we make progress on those, we will ask again, we'll pick more. This is an ongoing commitment to being better as a company. And that starts with you telling us what would make a difference. And again, I think I have found that when you frame the both ask the act of asking and also what you intend to do with the answers in a way that signifies mutual respect, that sets expectations, and that also identifies, look, like nobody lives in, a perfect world of rainbows and butterflies and, we all eat ice cream. Like, people understand that work is tough and that changing organizations is tough. And when you genuinely ask and you show a commitment to materially move on even 1 or 2 items, I have seen organizations time and time again be surprised by the willingness of their teams to tell them what would make a difference. Because most people don't want to change jobs, right? Most people would just prefer to enjoy where they work and be treated with a basic level of respect and have some sort of, path to give feedback when that's not the case. If you can make it easier for your team or your employees to guide you in the direction of being a company that they would want to stay at, for a lot of people, that is going to be very preferable than them having to go through all of the work of finding a new job.
Absolutely. Yeah, because they've already invested a lot of time.
Oh, and it's
in the
scary to
process.
find a new job too. I mean, yes,
It
there
is.
are a small number of people who relish the process, often people that are the kind of top talent, they know their worth. Great. We
Right.
all are very, very happy for them.
Right. Yes.
And that exists. But for most people, the process of changing companies and jobs, it is high stress. It is full
Hmm.
of anxiety. It's a tremendous amount of work that they aren't being paid for. And
Yes.
so I find that companies are sometimes just very quick to throw up their hand. Everybody will leave
Hmm.
anybody. People are just dissatisfied. Look, yes, there are always frustrating and
Hmm.
entitled people who will make, demands that can't be met. That is a fact of human existence in
Right.
every form. But for the vast majority of people, truly, like, they would prefer to stay in most
Right.
cases if
Right.
your company could just meet a few more of their needs. And I think that can actually be very liberating. Again, it's not about being perfect. It's not about being better than Google.
Hmm.
There's a lot of people, they could go work at Google, or maybe that's not even what they want, or maybe they couldn't work. It's not about competing with some sort of
Hmm.
idealized business that gets sort of lauded as the best. Like, good for them. It's about figuring out who you are and how you be the best version of you. And by the way, that's true for most human relationships, right?
Absolutely. I'm going to take you down a little bit of a cul-de-sac, and ask the question as I'm listening to us have this conversation. One of the biggest questions I would have as someone who is potentially seeking a new position, researching companies, maybe the lists, aren't as helpful as maybe we have thought they were in the past. Is there a few indicators that a job seeker should look at when researching a company that would actually give them an indication of what they're selling is actually true or not true?
Mm. Yes. There's a few things I think can be helpful flags that will point you in the direction of alignment, no alignment,
Mm,
need to ask more questions. So one is, can you get information on the company's benefits package? That often tells
mm,
you a fair bit about who they are trying to speak to and what problems they're trying to solve. Now, this doesn't
mm,
necessarily mean that those benefits are accessible to everyone. There's more research to be done, but it can
mhm,
be helpful just to understand a little bit about, what is it that they offer at a baseline level. It's one of the reasons why, when the Muse was thinking about how we make job search better, one of the first things we did was allow people to search for jobs by benefits. So they could say,
wow.
I want to only look at engineering positions in this geographic area that have fully covered parental leave or adoption assistance, or
Mm,
whatever it is that matters most to you. Again, it's a flag, it's an indicator.
mhm,
During an interview process, whether the company invites you to ask questions and whether they seem genuinely interested in you learning about them,
mm,
not just vetting you, is a very interesting indicator. I think that, in my experience, companies that take a more respectful or mutual approach to the employee employer
mm,
relationship understand that a great employee has other options. And so they'll put some time and care in the
mhm,
interview process into helping the employee get their questions answered or the employee learn about them. It's a big flag for me when companies take an approach of, it is entirely us vetting you. And if you're
mhm.
so lucky to get a job, maybe we'll tell you something. Like, I'm sorry, that's a huge time commitment before I even know if I want to be here. So I think that can be a very
Mhm,
interesting signal when you're going through an interview process. I'm trying to think of what else is sort of top of mind. I mean, I do find it interesting. This is probably lower fidelity,
mhm,
but I do think it's interesting how companies write their job descriptions. Do they
mhm,
have a very rigid and aggressive approach to the requirements for a role, almost again
mm,
communicating that most people wouldn't even be able to work here. I don't know. Again, there's something to be said for, like, we are the best of the best, and
right.
I'm not really talking about that. I think there's a lot to be said for a commitment to excellence. But some job descriptions are written in a more inclusive versus a more almost rude or aggressive way. And again, I think that it can be difficult until you get deeper in a process and you have a chance to ask individuals to really understand. Those are some of the signals that I would recommend. I love when people are in an interview process. I love suggesting that people ask what I call paired questions or twinned questions, which is a positive and a negative at the same time. And this is, by the way, another great thing for HR leaders or recruiters who want to communicate more authentically about a company culture, but don't want to seem like they're sharing negatives. For a candidate, this might look like asking someone, what do you think are some of the best attributes about the company culture here at Acme Corporation? And what do you think are some of the challenges, or what are some of the things that might lead someone to be really successful here? What are some of the things that could frustrate someone or cause someone not to work out? For a recruiter, again, this could be, I want to give you a chance to learn about our company culture. So I thought I'd start with just telling you, this is a bit about what makes us great. And these are some of the things that might not be for everyone. It's that twinning of a good and a challenge that I think makes it easier to ask or answer and get something that feels a little real.
That is such great feedback. And I had never heard about looking at benefits as an indicator for the company. That's brilliant. That's brilliant. I have never heard that before. So, new news, HR, it's your benefits. So we have talked a lot about, you teed us off at the beginning talking about shift shock and that toxicity and the difference between maybe what they were sold and what they're experiencing in the workplace is different. So now that was the number one trend, the toxicity. What is the number two trend?
So the number two trend is a lack of flexible or changing policies around remote work and work from home. And I think this is a big one for leaders to understand, because there's been a lot of grandstanding in the press, frankly, on all sides of this debate. Some people feel very, very strongly one direction, another, et cetera. But what we are seeing is that this is the second biggest driver of employee departures, is lack of flexibility or changing policies around remote work and work from home. And interestingly, it also comes up as one of the, if not the number one attribute that job seekers are looking for in where they'll join. And I think that, there are differences between what executives would prefer when polled in large numbers and what employees or talent would prefer when polled in large numbers. And when you break that polling down by various demographic aspects, especially gender, you actually get even more stark differences. And we've seen this firsthand because as you mentioned in your intro, I founded and have built the Muse, which serves all genders. And last year we acquired Fairy Godboss, which is an exclusively female-focused community. So when we've polled the Muse user base on their preferences in office, hybrid, or work from home, we've seen that about 40% want to be fully remote, about 40% want to be hybrid, some in, some out, and about 20% want to be in person full-time. But when we've asked the same question on the Fairy Godboss side, exclusively to women, we're actually seeing only about 3% of women want to go back into the office full-time. And then something like 53% are looking for hybrid, and mid-40s are looking for remote only. So very, very clear swing towards flexibility. And I think that, sometimes I see bosses point to an article that Goldman Sachs is requiring people to come back into the office. And they're saying, see, I can too. And you know what? Maybe you can. But Goldman Sachs gets away with a lot of things because they're Goldman Sachs.
Yes.
And so I just encourage leaders to think about, what are all of the different things that you want from your employees? What are all of the different things that you are offering to your employees? And if they truly want remote or flexible work, how many people are you willing to lose to enforce a different perspective? And could you perhaps increase retention and satisfaction substantially by adopting some of the flexibility that your team wants, while holding firm on some of the things that are most important to you, but again, taking a compromise approach. So that is a very interesting one, because again, the data is very clear that a significant percentage of employees are willing to leave and look for a new job in order to find more flexibility.
So the Muse is, I believe, going to be asking employees how they actually define work-life balance. And this could potentially be helpful for our listeners because, as you said, it's such a hot button issue. What is the status of that survey so that we can kind of make sure that we bring that back to our audience and they can get a little bit deeper info on what exactly employees and prospective employees want?
Yes, I'm very excited to do this survey and to share the results with you when they're live, because it's something, like you said, it's something that I think different people use the term work-life balance to mean different things. And there are huge gaps between those things. So I often hear on one side managers saying, everyone's always talking about work-life balance. These kids just don't want to work anymore.
Right.
Okay, well, if work-life balance means I don't have to do work, that is a very or I only have to work when I want to work, not when somebody else wants me to work, or I'd have to work a dot past 5 p.m. or whatever it is. There's big differences in between how people characterize work-life balance. In one of my earlier jobs before I started the Muse, I worked in a culture where your time was not your own. You might have committed to go out to dinner with your mother for her birthday at 8 p.m. But if the client needed something, sorry, mom, you were stuck at your desk. Versus a work environment where perhaps you were expected to get the client what they needed. But if you wanted to do it at midnight because you wanted to leave and go really dedicate time to your family and then come back and finish what's due. And then still a third environment that says the client request will be handled whenever it's handled because, you're off and that's it. Those are three very different concepts of work-life balance. And I think just like remote work is this somewhat fuzzy idea that means different things to different individuals, I think work-life balance, we collectively need to get a bit better at defining it. So again, personally, I work a lot and I work very hard, but what's important to me is having autonomy over when and where that work gets done. Someone who says, I want work-life balance, I never want to look at a computer or phone after 5 p.m. might not be successful at a business that I run. But if they say, my family, my hobbies, all of these other things are important, so I'm willing to work hard, but I want to say when I do it, fantastic. We're very aligned.
Yes.
And again, I think that what I'm hoping to learn from this survey is really more insight as to where there are disconnect between what leaders, managers, employers think when they talk about work-life balance and employees, specifically Gen Z and millennial employees. Are there differences by race or ethnicity or gender that are relevant to this? Because again, clearly work-life balance is a priority for candidates, but I think we could get a lot more specific around describing what matters. And by the way, someone who's listening, you can just ask your team. I can tell you what a couple thousand people on themuse.com think about work-life balance, but I would absolutely encourage someone to work with their colleagues to find out, if we were going to make one change that would improve work-life balance at this company, what would it be? You can give people open source. You can give people 5 options. You can ask X or Y. But the culture at each company might lead to a slightly different adjustment or improvement that could make the most benefit. And so I love this data that's sort of cross-sectional. But I also think sometimes it's truly about what works for the people that work for you.
Well, we will be waiting with bated breath for this research because I think it is incredibly powerful to ask the question and to define exactly where maybe the challenge is coming from, right? So at the top of the hour, we talked about the shift shock of your research, what you're finding. So you found toxicity, you found flexibility. Was there anything else that you found in this report that you wanted to share with us as we kind of wrap up this portion of the podcast?
I would say that one point that I do think just bears repeating here, because it's something that I get asked about a lot, is we actually did see that a non-trivial number of people were thinking about leaving a company or quitting a job because of a lack of diversity or a lack of commitment to DEI. And I think that is an interesting one, because when you force rank diversity against, a toxic workplace culture, there are more people who typically say, okay, I don't want to work in a toxic workplace culture.
Right.
But candidates, particularly great candidates, they're not just picking their number one thing and making all of their decisions based on that. In fact, a lot of great candidates, they believe that they should be able to have their top 3 or 4 things. And so we're seeing candidates that say, I want to work for an environment that's respectful, that's not toxic. I care about flexibility and work-life balance in the way that I mean it, which obviously we collectively need to get better at defining. And I want a place that has an inclusive atmosphere. And part of what that means, by the way, is this idea of allowing employees to be humans, not just sort of robots or interchangeable pegs that all fit exactly the same thing, that are just there to do a job. But I think that a lot of modern workplaces are acknowledging that their teams, their employees, have other responsibilities, they have other passions, they're subject to a variety of different situations and pressures and things based on who they are and how the world interacts with people who look like them. And so it's this kind of, I think, just more nuanced understanding that a lot of great businesses are doing, that, we want to be a place that celebrates all of our people. We want to be a place that is kind and respectful. And so it's interesting, we asked our users, and we asked kind of a cross-section of individuals on the Muse, which initiatives are most impactful when you're assessing whether a company is kind of pursuing inclusion in a meaningful way. The number one was diverse leadership at the company. So, again, it's not just about what a company says, but I think it's about what they do and who you see when you look up at the top. So, I'll say we can obviously have an entire episode about that. I think there's a lot of additional really interesting things to say, but we are seeing, particularly for Gen Z and millennial candidates, that there's just less tolerance for companies that are monocultures, and a lot of interest in companies that celebrate different forms of people.
And I think the big wrap up here is for HR and the companies that they represent to represent exactly who they are, and not try to sugarcoat or try to give only the pluses, but to also give some of the minuses. Because I would think, as I coach overachievers and outperformers is what I call them, they like a good challenge. So be truthful and give them a challenge that they can help you accomplish at your organization.
And by the way, I want to just +1 that, because I could not agree more. I think it is so much more effective to tell a candidate, hey, we're here as a company and we want to be here. And so we want to recruit you to be part of the team that is going to make us better. This is far more effective than lying about where you are, misrepresenting. And by the way, it's true for diversity. It's also true for things like old school businesses that are trying to be more innovative. It is a recipe for failure to try and recruit high innovation candidates by promising them that you are a high innovation environment if you are not. It's much more successful to say, look, we have, a 75-year history as X. We're really good at these things. We recognize that we could be more innovative. We want to speed up the pace and, bring in new processes for soliciting and acting on new ideas. And we recognize that this is something that we've got to get better at. So we want to bring you in. We want you to join and help us do that. Again, if somebody knows that they will only be happy in an environment where that's already happening, they might say no to your job, and that would be great for both of you, because the alternative is that they join and then immediately become frustrated, disaffected, disgruntled,
Mm-hmm.
versus there are a lot of people, like you said, that love a challenge. And they're like, you know what? Yes, I am
Yes.
on board with helping drive this. And all of a sudden you've gotten somebody who has bought in. They're going to be far less surprised by the inevitable bumps and challenges at the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
because every business has them. And then they understand where you're trying to go.
Completely agree. I think we need to have you back for part 2. But for now, we have this portion of the podcast called Rapid Fire Questions. So these are 1-sentence questions with 1-sentence answers that we ask some of our guests so that the audience gets to know you a little bit better. Are you willing to play?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay. So what advice would you give to a smart driven college student about to enter the real world? And what advice would you tell them to ignore?
The advice I would give is to become a human sponge and learn as much as possible in your first few years, because never again will you have such a great opportunity
Mm-hmm.
to learn and try and fail and be universally not expected to know how to do much of anything from the get-go. I think it's a brilliant time for exploration and growth and taking risks. That can be harder to recreate later in your career.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of what advice I would tell them to ignore, I don't know if this is advice, but I had a bunch of people tell me like work's work. If it was fun, they wouldn't pay you. Psh. I mean, of course, look, again, nobody's workplace is just like petting kittens all day. Like everybody's work, everybody's job has challenges, but you can and should enjoy what you do. And it's okay if you have to try a few different things to figure out what that is. That's part of it, for better or worse.
That's the fun. That's the fun.
Mm-hmm.
What are the 1 or 2 books that you have read that have greatly influenced your life or your career?
I would say Daring Greatly by Brene Brown has helped me with interpersonal relationships, communication, and vulnerability. And Start With Why by Simon Sinek. It's a classic, but has been just a tremendous unlock in terms of why I do what I do and how I enlist other people in my quests to make the world a little better, a little different.
Mm-hmm. What move did you make that had the biggest positive impact on your career?
So this is an unconventional answer, but right before I started the Muse, I took a 6-month contract assignment to work on vaccines in East Africa, living in Kigali, Rwanda, primarily. And even though I recognized doing that role that it wasn't the right long-term path for me, I am so grateful that I crossed it off my list by actually doing it, because it allowed me to fully dive in to building a company with as few as possible open questions, or not regrets, but I never wanted to look back and think, what if I'd moved to Rwanda? Might I have taken that path? And I found a way to do it, and it was a 6-month. I had to negotiate very hard to get that kind of a shorter contract length, but hugely impactful. And I loved the experience, and I've loved the mental freedom that it gave me, recognizing that that wasn't the path that was right for me.
Who's your mentor or industry role model, and why?
So I've always been more drawn to the idea of board of advisors. There are a couple of different people that I consider to play the role of mentor or role model in different ways. I'm currently obsessed with Joanna Coles, who led Hearst for several years, and I think is just a total powerhouse. I've had a couple of different CEOs and founders who have helped me avoid some of the mistakes that they've made, and been someone I could turn to. So I'd say, there's only one of any of us. And so rather than just maybe picking one person, I'd say I always love having a small collection
It's
of
always
folks.
best. It's always best. What's the main takeaway that you want to leave with our listeners?
I would just encourage anyone who works in HR, who works in leadership, to think about how their organization can listen and be a little bit more responsive, if possible. And it's such a blanket statement, right? I'm sure there's so many people listening whose organizations do an incredible job of this. And there's others who probably want to and can't get leadership to invest the time or resources or funds. But I do think a shift is coming in, and is here, frankly, in how employees expect to be treated. And I think companies that are responsive will attract and keep the best, and companies that are not are going to fall behind. And so I would just encourage somebody, if your organization isn't listening, try your best to change it. And if it won't change, maybe you could do more good in a different organization.
Where can people go to learn more about you?
I would love that. People can check out themuse.com, which is the company that I spend most of my time building. They can find me on Twitter at Kmin, Kmin, or on LinkedIn at Kathryn Minshew. I post fairly frequently in both places. I am also on Instagram, but you're more likely to get a little quote or a funny meme or something from my personal life there. Twitter and LinkedIn are a bit more business. And then, I would just love to hear feedback. I try and be responsive on especially Twitter, but Instagram or LinkedIn as well, if anyone has feedback or further questions.
Today, we have been joined by Kathryn Minshew, CEO and founder of the Muse. Thanks again for joining me, Kathryn. It has been such a pleasure.
I really enjoyed it as well. Thank you so much for having me.
When I originally wrote Winning the Talent Shift, it was never intended to be published. In fact, I wrote it for our daughter, Lauren, as a college graduation gift to tell her everything that she needed to know about toxic workplaces and how to navigate them. As the C-suite executive, I had encountered and witnessed what toxicity can do to talented individuals. I saw it ruin good people and their careers, especially at the hands of others who aspired more power and would stop at nothing to get it. I interviewed outperforming talent from across the globe, and what I concluded was that 100% of high performers, those that drive 5 times the profit of a low performer, are targeted, bullied, and abused in today's workplaces. If you were a person of color or a woman, that would happen at 2 times the rate of your male counterparts. In the book, I told real stories and changed the names to protect the abused. And I provided real-world examples on how to handle the situation and come out stronger and more prepared. And I put the onus on the C-suite and especially HR to identify and stop the toxicity, because out of all the leaders in the workplace, we were the ones who had the power to protect the very people that we hire and develop and promote and want to keep. With HR leading the charge, we can create workplaces that people want to come to each and every day to give their best and to have both their best life and career. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode of Voices of HR, and thank you for playing an important role in making your workplaces toxic-free. We've included additional articles in the episode notes, and if we can help you in any way, please do not hesitate to contact us at podcast@hrmorning.com or baldrich@bertaaldrich.com. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks so much for watching. We would love it if you shared your thoughts on any of the topics we discussed in the comments below. And if you got value from the video, it would mean the world to us if you hit the like button and subscribe to the HR Morning channel. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Voices of HR.